That's probably one of the more common, I think, flavors you would get from it.
Definitely like a Bazooka Joe kind of.
When you say it, I smell it.
Just like when you open up a pack of bubble gum, when you
That
smell
was
it,
like that
before you put it in your
Bazooka.
mouth,
Yeah, that's
you
one.
get that sugary part of it.
Now this is, it's interesting because actually, although very few people use carbonic maceration, so to speak, as the primary technique in winemaking, it's very vogue these days, especially in California, to do what they call whole bunch fermentation. So Pinot Noir or Syrah, for instance, they bring the grapes into the winery, they throw it, same thing, they throw it right into a tank. They don't necessarily cover it with CO2, but they do this thing where they throw it in and they kind of let it sit for a few days and they sort of collapse under the weight of their own grapes before the fermentation happens. And they do this to extract more color because it's very cool to have a really dark wine, right? And it's kind of a way to get a jump start on the color of the wine. And what it also does is if you leave the berries whole, the seeds get protected, they stay inside the grape. So there's a lot of harsh tannin in those seeds that you don't want to pull out. So it's a sort of a modern way of making wine, so you get a bigger, darker wine without that harsh old school tannin. So, and you also get a little bit of that carbonic character in it, even though that's not really why they do it. So it's an interesting point. Another thing the winemaker can do is what's known as malolactic fermentation, and we talk about this sometimes, generally in reference to Chardonnay, usually. What malolactic fermentation is a process that all wines will go through naturally unless the winemaker chooses to stop the process. And what it is grapes have malic acid in them. It's just a naturally occurring acid. It's a very sharp, sort of biting acid. It's the acid common in apples, you know, that real tart Granny Smith kind of acid. And what they do is the bacteria, or the malolactic bacteria, take that and they use it as a metabolic food, and they eat it and they convert it to lactic acid, which is kind of a softer acid. It's a milk acid, you know, lactose, lactic acid. And one of the things that happens during this process is the bacteria give off these flavors that are very unique. The primary one that most people may have heard of is diacetyl, and you'll know this one every time you put a bag of microwave popcorn into the oven. The flavor of artificial butter is diacetyl, and that's a really powerful aroma that comes from the malolactic fermentation. It's used, it shows up a lot in barrel fermented Chardonnays, and a lot of times it's something you don't really want. So there are ways to get rid of it. It just happens, it's a natural thing, and there are ways to deal with it and to get rid of it, but it is something that tends to stick around in the wine. So you will get buttery flavors, and we'll see that in actually one of the examples we're going to do next. The other reason, of course, that they do malolactic fermentation is because it softens the acid bite in the wine. Sometimes in a fresher Chardonnay, they don't do it because they want that brighter acidity, that malic acid, to stick around. Another secondary aroma that sometimes a winemaker goes for is something they get from lees contact. And Chris hit on this earlier or last week in the cava, when we tasted the cava. That sort of biscuity, nutty butter, bready character, that comes from lees contact. That's actually the yeast sediment. So when the wine ferments, the yeast cells multiply and they grow, and then after the fermentation subsides, they kind of fall to the bottom of the wine. Maybe they put it into barrel at that point, and then some of it will precipitate to the bottom of the barrel. And they actually use this as a technique. They could do it in tank as well. If they let it sit, they let the wine age on that lees, they call it. And as the yeast consume all the sugar and everything that is there for them to eat, they start to die. And what they do when they start to die is they're like, we're in trouble, we're going to die. So they start to eat themselves. They start to digest their cell wall, and they sort of fall apart. It's a last-ditch effort at survival. And then what happens is you get these flavors released into the wine, these sort of biscuity, butter, creamy flavors. And you also get other things that aren't aroma-related. You get density in the wine. You get palate density, because some of the polysaccharides in the cell walls of the yeast dissolve into the wine and give it more density and weight. So lees flavor is a very common thing, and I give some examples where you'll commonly come across it. Champagne, Cava, Muscadet from up in the Loire. Muscadet really has very little flavor on its own. The primary flavor comes from the lees contact. Chablis is another place where they use it often. We don't have any examples of that, and we kind of smelled it last week, so last meeting, there's not much point to go over it again. Now here's a big one. Here's one that we talk about a lot in the wine world, oak. Right? Oak is a big, it's a sore point with some people, it's a positive for some people, it's a controversial thing. Oak does a lot for wine. We're going to talk about what it does to the aroma. And I think we'll start passing the wine around so we can get pouring while I discuss it. I'm going to pass the first wine around, the Travis Chardonnay. This is going to be the unoaked example. So keep it to one side, and then we'll do a side-by-side with the Lafond.
Now, is the Travis Travis doesn't go through Maryland, does it?
I think it's another little bit of a complication. There's no great, really, comparison of wines that we have that I could think of that were.
Because I thought that has no malolactic fermentation.
Yeah, but that's going to be more of an acid thing. As far as aroma goes, you know.
You won't get some of the butter, maybe.
Yeah, you might not get some of the buttery character, but a lot of the buttery character in the Lafond doesn't come from mallow anyway, it's from the oak, I think. And the last couple times I had the Lafond Chard, it was pretty oaky, so it might be a really good comparison. When it comes to oak, it's not just whether you use oak or whether you don't use oak. There are a lot of sort of subsets of things you need to consider. The first and maybe the most important thing when it comes to oak is where the oak comes from. So I've broken it down here. We don't need to go too much into detail, but you've all heard the term French oak, or some of you have heard. French oak tends to be the most sought after oak for wine aging. The reason is because it's the nature of the wood. It has a very tight grain. The flavors that it imparts to the wine are very rounded and very elegant.
Does that mean it comes from a French forest?
It comes from a French forest. There are several forests. I didn't want to go into too much detail because it can become overwhelming. It's like a whole science in itself. But in general, we often talk about French oak, American oak. French oak is the expensive oak. I mean, a new French oak barrel can be $700-800 per barrel. I was actually using a calculator last night and working out what it would cost. And roughly in some wines, say a $20 wholesale wine, if they used all new French oak on that wine, it could be upwards of 10-15% of the cost of the wine just from the new oak barrels. So it's a big cost. So people tend to want to get away from that to save some money. One of the alternatives is American oak. The problem with American oak is that, a problem or positive, depends on what you're trying to do. American oak is a little more vulgar in its flavors. It gives you this powerful coconut, vanilla, dill sort of flavors. I think actually the Histoire Cab, I get a lot of American oak out of that. That would have been a good example, but it's got this really intense kind of dill flavor, like fresh dill to it.